Global Approaches on State Fragility and Organized Crime. My name is Mauricio Vieira. I am the head of the chair on countering illicit trade and preventing transnational organized crime at the University for Peace in Costa Rica. Today, it is my pleasure to present the collective book titled Global Approaches on State Fragility and Organized Crime that was launched June this year. This is the first collective publication under the chair on countering illicit trade and preventing transnational organized crime at University for Peace. And this book covers the organized crime and state fragility nexus through different perspectives based in the context of countries from Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And in this book, we had a collaboration of 13 authors and experts on the theme. And basically everyone involved in this process worked throughout the term failed state, which means that it is a very different perspective of state fragility. And even though this term, failed state, had its origin and computation into the political lexicon that is correlated, highlighting the difference between state fragility and failed states is important for comprehending the argument and the narrative that permeate this book. Before asking and having the participation of some of the contributors of this book, I would like to highlight briefly some of the chapters from authors that will not be possible to join us for today. In the first chapter of this book, written by the Vice Rector of UPEACE, Juan Carlos Sainz Burgo, he discusses the correlation between organized crime and peace building as a parameter for comprehending that the state's main function is the management and equal distribution of political goods to society. Sainz Burgo began his argument through the historical narrative behind the payment of taxes in the Egyptian or Roman societies as a source for constructing the state's current institutional apparatus and structure. If such function is not completely achieved or is dysfunctional in a sense, then the state's capacity on providing political goods not only becomes vulnerable to structural challenges, but also acute to practices of criminality, violence, and the increase of organized criminal dynamics with a direct impact on peace. The second chapter was written by Megan Kapp and Christopher Vibb. And now it is my pleasure to invite Megan Kapp, who is a PhD candidate from the University for Peace, to present the main findings of her chapter entitled Children of Incarcerated Parents, the Impact of Criminalization for Drug Offenses in Latin America. Megan, it is a pleasure to have you in the Global Organized Crime Conference. Welcome.
Thank you, Mauricio. Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone joining us here today. My chapter recognizes that within efforts to combat drug trafficking and organized crime, one impacted group is notably absent from the discourse. Children of incarcerated parents face unique vulnerabilities when their parents come into conflict with the law, but are rarely, if ever, considered in criminal justice responses. My research looked at the available literature to attempt to understand the experiences of these children. Specifically for this book chapter, I focused on the experiences of children whose parents were incarcerated for drug offenses in Latin America. A consistent global trend is that children whose parents are involved with criminal justice systems are more vulnerable to negative health and social outcomes compared to their peers whose parents are not involved in justice systems. There is also a racialized component with a growing recognition that Indigenous and minority children are disproportionately impacted by the effects of parental incarceration. While little is known about the experiences of children of incarcerated parents in Latin America, what we do know is in line with global research, which shows us that parental incarceration is an extremely traumatic experience. Impacted children face an immediate disruption to their lives. They may witness violence at the hands of the arresting officers, and they often face tremendous stigma among their peers and within their communities. Without appropriate supports, these children may repeat their parents' pattern of criminality. Our current research base shows that these supports do not currently readily exist in Latin America, and the impact on children is rarely, if ever, considered when a parent is facing a criminal justice process. The time is right to have these conversations and bring awareness to the unique needs of these children. As I discuss in my chapter, globally, women are the fastest growing prison population, and this trend continues across Latin America. This is problematic as women are most often the caregivers of their children, and their incarceration has a more disruptive effect on their families. Due to the lack of data being collected, it's impossible to provide an exact number of how many children are impacted by parental incarceration, but research has suggested 1.7 to 2.3 million children across Latin America are impacted. My research found that across Latin America, drug offenses are the most common reason women were incarcerated. These women were often performing low-level drug activities, including acting as couriers or smuggling contraband into prisons. They sometimes work behind the scenes, cultivating, cleaning, storing, packaging, or delivering shipments of narcotics. They engage in high-risk, low-rank tasks and can easily be replaced when removed from the operation. It's also important to note that the existing research shows that the majority of women incarcerated for drug crimes in Latin America are living in communities where poverty and other socioeconomic challenges are commonplace. My research found that when criminal justice responses focus on incarcerating women for low-level drug crimes, it not only negatively impacts their children, but also takes away resources from fighting the high-level leaders of the drug trade, which can have an impact on state fragility. It further takes resources away from fighting corruption, which is allowed to flourish and contributes to the festering of organized crime. This can also impact state fragility. Current strategies to combat organized crime have not reflected on the periphery impact on offenders' families and communities. Due to a lack of research and understanding of the situation, we do not yet know what the impacts of the many tough on crime strategies seen across the region will have on the next generation. Existing research does tell us that there is cause for concern. My research led me to multiple recommendations. First, we need to further understand the experiences of these children. More research is needed, which focuses on hearing the voices of these children and their mothers, fathers, and caregivers. We need to understand the barriers that they all face at each stage of the criminal justice process, including arrest, pretrial detention, incarceration, and their eventual reintegration back into community. Secondly, the experiences of these children and the harm caused to them should be considered by criminal justice responses to drug crimes. Again, this consideration should happen at all levels of the criminal justice process. Child-friendly arrest policies should be developed, and parents should be supported to maintain contact with their children while in prison through child-friendly visiting programs. Judges should be trained on the negative impacts of parental incarceration and should consider this in sentencing processes. All of those who come into contact with these children, including those outside of the criminal justice system, such as nurses, teachers, and others, should be trained in the unique realities of these children and how to destigmatize their experiences. Finally, for low-level drug offenses committed by women in communities filled with poverty and social exclusion, incarceration should be a last resort. Non-custodial measures such as house arrest, a suspended sentence, or community service should be considered where appropriate and balanced with public safety considerations to allow the mother to maintain the connection with her child. There are indeed a variety of international norms and standards which require criminal courts to prioritize the best interests of children in all decisions that may affect them. This includes in situations where their parent is facing incarceration. I am very aware that writing blue sky recommendations in a book chapter does not make resources fall from the sky and translate to action on the ground. I offer these recommendations for the consideration of those who are doing the work on the ground and from the lens of supporting the best interest of the child. Achieving lasting and sustainable change to improve the situations of these children requires a concerted effort across sectors and including a wide range of stakeholders. I'm not the right person to drive this agenda forward within Latin America. I'm aware of my positionality as a Canadian researcher, and my chapter in the book must be viewed as a starting point upon which other Latin American researchers and practitioners can build. To create transformative change for those most impacted by these issues, we need involvement from the communities who are directly experiencing these situations. I'm here to support the empowerment of impacted communities and to support Latin Latin American researchers and practitioners through my roles with the Canadian Coalition of Children of Incarcerated Parents and the International Coalition for Children of Incarcerated Parents. If my research and my talk here today has inspired you to action, please reach out to me via email or LinkedIn, and together we can work to improve the situation of these children. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Megan Kapp. It was an excellent contribution and presentation. I would like briefly just to highlight a summary of chapter 3 that was written by Vinicius Assis Couto, Claudio Dantas Monteiro, and Barbara Diniz Caldeira, that they reflected on the actions taken by organized criminal groups and drug trafficking during the COVID-19 pandemic in Brazil. Vinicius, Claudio, and Barbara will not join us today, but in the chapter, they argued that the COVID-19 pandemic functioned as a more recent example of organized criminal groups' ability to adapt, even though such analysis will require medium and long-term evaluations in the future. In their chapter, Couto, Monteiro, and Caldeira also argue that there are indications that criminal groups have adapted to the current scenario by strengthening or creating new dynamics for action, which could lead to both medium and long-term changes in the drug trafficking in Brazil. Our discussion on Latin America continues with the participation of Fausto Carvajal Glass from Mexico, who holds a master's degree in war studies from King's College London. His chapter focuses on the political trajectory of organized crime in Mexico. Good to see you, Fausto, and welcome to the conference on organized crime.
Thank you very much, Mauricio. It is very cool to share a panel for the 4th time this year. I'm not complaining. It's always a pleasure. Instead, so and well, thank you very much for coordinating this book. I'm going to share my presentation. So give me a second. Yeah. There you go. So now, without further ado, I would like to get straight to into the essence of the book chapter, entitled, as Mauricio said, "The Political Trajectory of Organized Crime in Mexico." The book chapter seeks to explore what I called the political trajectory in light of 4 major qualitative changes, or let's say trends. Criminal groups in Mexico have become more violent in their tactics. They have become more economically diverse, fragmented, and geographically strategic. As a consequence, the political dimension of organized crime should also, or might also, evolve over the years, particularly at the local level. So that is why the chapter focuses on what I think are 2 cross-fertilizing questions. The first one is, what does organized crime mean for the statecraft at the local level? And what is the role of criminal groups in a community? I would argue that answering these 2 questions is essential to improve our understanding of and response to organized crime in Mexico, and possibly other countries in Latin America facing similar challenges in terms of public security and, in particular, organized crime activity. So, in order to answer these questions, the chapter compares and contrasts 2 analytical approaches. The first one is the extra-legal forms of governance, and this approach, well, allow me to say both of them, and the complex social order. The first approach, which is more commonly employed, delves into how alternative forms of governance by criminal groups pops up and evolve across time. It is worth mentioning that I'm critical about this first approach, and therefore the book chapter is critical about this first approach. On the other hand, the second analytical approach addresses the informal institutions that criminal groups use at the local level, but which are part of a broader complex social setting in which legal actors, both political and economic actors, interact with legal ones in several ways. So this chapter expands on the second approach as its main argument. So I'm gonna elaborate a little bit more on this second approach. The severe fragmentation and increasingly local scope of organized crime in Mexico has made the analysis of power relations and tensions between criminal groups and private actors all the more necessary. These private actors include, among others, political parties, unions, politicians, local and national entrepreneurs, ranchers, and multinational companies, just to name a few. But that is why it's a very complex environment. This approach emphasizes the way in which organized crime relates to power, particularly the concentration and conservation of it. More concretely, I argue that these power interactions, in which organized crime indeed plays a violent and political role, are associated with the search of and maintenance of power by private actors, most of the times related to land access, economic hegemony, and political domination. So these are private actors, legal ones, using the macro cleavage, I'm paraphrasing Sadis Calibas, known as, for instance, war on drugs or criminal violence, to further private interests. The complex social order analytical approach, of course, does not intend to assign less seriousness to the role of criminal groups in Mexico. Indeed, criminal groups may play a political role in many Mexican communities, and maybe potentially other communities in Latin American countries, insofar as they seek, concentrate, and exert power. However, and this is kind of the nuance that I would like to posit here, they are also involved politically at the local level, as they help other actors, private ones, to seek, concentrate, and exert power through coercive means and high-intensity violence. Although it might be a little bit subtle, this epistemological shift demystifies the subordination of all actors in a community to organized crime, and this goes contra sensu to the omnipotence that is commonly portrayed on entertainment platforms. Indeed, criminal groups have worked to integrate themselves into these power tensions in a community by forging alliances and coalitions of convenience with private legal actors. So just to wrap up this first round, what are the implications of this research, particularly this book chapter? I would like to focus on two. First, that no institutional design will be able to shape local politics and collective will in a community. And secondly, and I would like to expand more on this one due to the time, any strategy attempting to pacify or, let's say, stabilize violence in complex settings will definitely fail if it doesn't work as a mediator among local political and economic actors and kind of balance their politically conflicting interests. After all, in order to consolidate institutions, in order to pursue state building or nation building actions, we need institutions of local unity, let's say a local police force. Otherwise, and paradoxically, state building could have undesired effects in divided communities. We need to take into consideration that these communities have solved problems by using force. So after all, negotiation, reconciliation, and peace-building processes, as well as post-conflict justice, are prerequisites to nation building at the local level. So I should leave it here for now. Thank you very much, Mauricio.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fausto, for your presentation and for your contribution. I just want to also briefly summarize the 3 other chapters from authors that were not able to join us for today. In chapter 5 of the book, Emma Faris analyzes the context of organized crime and corruption through the role of sanctions imposed by the United States government in countries with acute levels of fragility. Emma Faris centers her analysis on 2 Latin American countries, Nicaragua and Venezuela, due to their similarities with regard to institutional deterioration, existence of criminal networks, corruption, and impunity. In her argument, the level of state fragility in both Nicaragua and Venezuela has permitted the governments of these countries to remain in power and maintain the status quo. Moving from Latin America to Africa, in chapter 6, Brahima Bilali contributes to this book through an analysis on South Sudan and the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in the country. Taken in the independence process of South Sudan in 2011 as a starting point, Bilali argues that the proliferation of small arms and light weapons was enabled by the state's level of weaknesses, which, as a consequence, undermined South Sudan's internal order, increased its level of violence, and intensified internal and intergroup violence in the country. In the following chapter, Chokuvu Omenma and Hans Ludwig Dinel analyze the role of the local community in countering organized crime in the Lake Chad area through participatory decision-making processes. Omenma and Dinel focus their analysis on the Kanuri ethnic group in the northeast state of Borno. Built on dependent variables and explanatory variables, they argue that, on the one hand, the potential of local structures to address organized crime, organized criminalities has been underutilized, and on the other hand, that subgroups among the Kanuri ethnic group at the village, ward, and district levels have contributed to strengthen cohesion, disrupt disinformation, and improve existing forms of security. Now, it is my pleasure to invite my colleague, Judy Kokoria, who is a research fellow of the Department of Political Studies and Governance, the University of Free State, South Africa. He is also an associate professor of the Department of Political Science, Niger Delta University in Nigeria. Dr. Kokoria wrote the chapter Political Elite, Horizontal Inequality and Instability in Nigeria. Jude, it is a pleasure to welcome you, please. And also an opportunity just to highlight that this is an opportunity for everyone to meet all the contributors of the book. Welcome, Jude. No, we cannot hear you. No, I think that we are facing some challenges with some technical problems, Jude. We cannot hear you. Oh, okay. Jude, okay. Yeah, yeah. I will, Jude, and for everyone that is attending the session, I will just move and present a summary of the other chapters while you, Jude, can figure out your sound. Okay? Okay. So in chapter 9, Dorcas Etang analyzes the role of civil society in the countering of organized crime in South Africa. Since South Africa is highly vulnerable to organized crime, not different from any other country in the world, the role of civil society becomes relevant due to the multitude of contributions that it can take, from oversight and monitoring to trauma support, and from victim and witness assistance to research and shaping discourse. From Africa to Asia, in chapter 10, Tilini Galapatiye examines the trafficking of women in the South Asian and South Asian subregions to comprehend the organized crime and state fragility nexus. Tilini also takes examples from Afghanistan, Pakistan, and Myanmar, and recognizes that the trafficking of women is cause, symptom, and consequence of state fragility. In her analysis, countries in these subregions improved their legal frameworks and enforcement mechanisms. However, there has been little progress in the fight against the trafficking of women, which is considered one of the world's main criminal markets. And the last chapter, the 11th one, was written by Zahid Zahab Ahmed. He analyzes the case of Afghanistan following the withdrawal of US troops. While the political decision implies expected outcomes regarding the functioning of the new government without an international intervention, it will also cause unexpected outcomes which derive from the concern on the increase in the level of state fragility. As Mohammed Ahmed mentioned in the chapter, the concern refers to the Taliban's modus operandi of running the country, which will lead to an increase in organized crime, with an attention to criminal markets such as narcotics, smuggling, and terrorism, and the impact of this scenario on regional security. I pass the floor to Jude. Can you?
Can you hear me now?
Yes,
All
we
right,
can hear you.
Thank God.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. It's a pleasure being here. So once again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all those who have tuned in. It's a pleasure being here. Oh, where have I gone to now? Okay. Sorry. Okay, but can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
Okay.
And we can hear you.
So my chapter virtually deals with how governments have contributed to the fragility of their state and then the growth of organized crime. And working on Nigeria, I'll begin my paper first with some statistics to give a background to the issue. Now, a UNICEF report 2021 states that 5.8 maternal deaths, virtually 6 maternal deaths, that Nigeria records approximately 6 maternal deaths for every 1,000 live births, and approximately 2,000 babies die at birth annually in the country, thereby posting one of the worst infant and maternal mortality rates in the world. Now, the World Population Review 2022 places Nigeria as 14th on the Fragile State Index scale, And the Institute for Economic Peace 2022 ranks Nigeria as 143 or 143rd out of 163 states on the Global Peace Index. Now, this presents a dire picture of the Nigerian society. Now, the World Bank in 2021 listed Nigeria as the poverty capital of the world. It's a country with a life expectancy of 55 years, which is amongst the lowest, not just in the world, but also in Africa. And now Nigeria also boasts a 62% literacy level. And the National Bureau of Statistics notes that unemployment, as at 2021, notes that unemployment rate in Nigeria is approximately 33.3%, which means that as of 2021, 1 in every 3 Nigerians was unemployed. And considering that Nigeria has a population of approximately 200 million, with the youths consisting about 140 million, you can imagine then the legion of unemployed youth. If we say 1 in every 3 is unemployed, that's virtually talking of a number of about 40 million Nigerians being unemployed. Now, amid all these dire negative statistics, it's surprising to note that Nigerian legislators are about the best paid in the world, while earning between $19,277 to $33,846 per month. Now, this is opposed to the minimum wage of $72 a month. So imagine these two crop of persons being in the same society, where a government appointee goes home with $34,000, and then the other goes home with $72. Now, the wage disparity, my chapter takes off on this wage disparity. Okay, now the argument that we make here is that in countries where you have such huge wage disparities, peace cannot exist. Okay, and that's because we'll find out that in countries where wage parity is at play, countries such as Norway and Switzerland, well, we talk about peace being built within their policies. Similarly, Rothberg, Collier, Levitsky, and Ziblatt, they state that states fail because they are ridden by internal violence, unable to protect their citizens, and lose legitimacy as the gap between the political elite and the minority widens. Now, what my paper tries to highlight is this, that governments in most developing countries are responsible for 2 major issues of conflict that lead to state fragility. A motivational speaker from Uganda states that if you want to get rich in Africa, you should join politics. So in this light, we find out that the quest for wealth leaves governance unattended to. And when governance is unattended to, we have huge swaths of ungoverned spaces. And from extant literature, we talk of ungoverned spaces refer to those areas where you have little or no government presence. Now, when this happens, crime syndicates, terrorist groups come in and provide the facilities and the services to the inhabitants of these regions that government ought to provide. And when this is done, the populations there become loyal to these crime syndicates and these terrorist groups, thereby increasing the insecurity in those regions. Okay, and there's also examining the Nigerian policy, drawing from Nigerian polity. It has been observed that the wider the disparity in income, the higher crime has become, and that is because when this disparity, where such disparity exists, we find that the legitimacy of the state is weakened, and this is because sorry, but let me get myself where we have such, where wage disparity increases, the state gradually loses its legitimacy. And where am I? Sorry, okay. Yes, and that is largely because there is an increase in inflation. There's increase in inflation because and all that, and life becomes more difficult for the citizens. Another aspect of my research looks at horizontal inequality. Now, when governments, because of the day, with the wage disparity that exists, those in power tend to hang on to power by getting the support because of their various groups. Now, when this happens, the groups of those in power, while supporting the government because of the day, you now have two groups, the in groups and the out groups. And the out groups, they become excluded from the politics because of the day. And at the end of the day, the areas occupied by these out groups now tends to become those areas that are excluded by the government. So what we have therefore is that we have a situation where the ethnic groups that are favored by the government of the day, those would happen to be or will find themselves in the area where the government where government policies tend to favor. Sorry, I'm not. No. So at the end of the day, what we now have is that to rectify this anomaly in the system, my research virtually states that the best way of addressing the issue of horizontal equality is building trust within the system, okay, and also is building trust within the system, and also trying to create what we'll refer to as horizontal parity, because it's a well-known fact that out groups get aggrieved, and when they are aggrieved, their grievances could be exploited, and that increases the level of insecurity within states. So, in a nutshell, what my research comes up with is one way of addressing the issue of horizontal inequality is for leaders or the leaders of thought and political elites to address issues through horizontal parity or equity, and this can only be done through fostering or mustering political will. So I guess I'll stop there. Because I guess I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jude Kokoria. It was a very interesting contribution, and everyone made a very interesting contribution on the nexus on organized crime and state fragility. And getting back to the discussion on this correlation between state fragility and organized crime, I would like just to highlight that this book has a common narrative that is under the term, actually the narrative under the term failed state is based on the notion that if political interventions addressed to countries labeled as failed aim to influence a behavioral change on them, improving their condition of failed into stability. The static condition that the term failed state implies actually limits any possibility of behavioral change and goes against the root cause of the failed condition. So in this regard, the term fragility, not failure, was examined further regarding state capacities in this specific publication that we are presenting today. So fragility is a broader concept than failure and directly refers to the causes and conditions that explain what states themselves, in cooperation with other states and international organizations, must address to revert the fragility that they face. So based on the main narrative that we have, all contributors, all authors, experts have developed and improved this narrative throughout the book, I have a common question to all of you. How the case study you provided in the chapter helped to advance the notion on the correlation between state fragility and organized crime? I would like to start this with Megan Kapp. Please, Megan.
Thank you, Mauricio. A very deep and thoughtful question. From the case study that I examined with my book chapter, I think I introduced a new concept to the study of organized crime. Traditional organized crime studies have focused very much on crime and the offender and punishments and retribution and creating some type of resolution to that without any consideration for the families and children impacted by that criminal justice response. I think another thing that my book chapter adds to the narrative, which is quite innovative and new, is the fact that criminality does have an intergenerational component. So the strategies that governments are currently using to combat organized crime are not only ineffective in some cases when they're focusing on especially women committing those low-level offenses, but it also creates the conditions for criminality to continue with their children, thus perpetuating this vicious cycle of criminality where you need stronger criminal justice responses. And it just creates a hamster wheel where it doesn't seem like there's much hope of getting off of that. So yeah, thank you for your question.
Thank you, Megan. It is very interesting, this human-centered approach on how understanding and analyzing the nexus between organized crime and state fragility. Excellent. Fausto, I give the floor to you, please.
Thanks, Mauricio. Well, this is kind of tied into the first policy implication. I would argue that my chapter helped to make visible and that aiming at imposing or reimposing the state in areas of where the state is fragile should bear in mind the limits of state building in complex social orders, particularly where organized crime operate. And this approach is sort of based on the critical studies, security critical studies. Also, we need to bear in mind that any security policy from the central government should bear in mind the community's socio-political environment and its components, namely key groups, relationships, and tensions among private actors, and also narratives resonating within the community. In other words, we need to take into consideration, and I say we as a central government, in the case we're working for the central government, the objective, means, and ways of the national government must couple the realities and intricacies of local politics. So bottom line, we need to acknowledge that organized crime is not an isolated entity. And this is another thing that I would say that my chapter argues. Rather, it is part of a social reality and also a consequence of political and economic dynamics. That would be my answer. Thanks, Mauricio.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fausto. Highlighting dynamics is very important to understand how this criminality works and impact on the capacity of the state. Just to remind you the question, how the case study you provided in the chapter helped to advance the notion on the correlation between state fragility and organized crime. I pass the floor to you, Judy, please.
Okay, state fragility. What my chapter virtually argued on how this keys goes into the theme is that when governments fail, there's a strong tendency for groups to want to band together to protect themselves from the impact of state failure. Now, when that happens, ethnic nationalism builds. And when ethnic nationalism builds, it becomes the foundation, the groundwork for other crimes like xenophobia and all that. But in terms of organized crime, when a government is bent on amassing wealth for itself, like I tried to explain initially. Hello?
Yes, Jude, we can hear you.
Okay, like I tried to explain initially, when a government is so bent on amassing wealth for itself, so much is left undone, so much is left unattended to, and we have a lot of ungoverned spaces, which become festering grounds for terrorist groups and for crime syndicates. So the essence here, therefore, is the only way to prevent this is for governments to be more focused on the things that they have to do. Now, also, when you have, I tried to key in horizontal inequality into this week, and I did a poor job because of that at the beginning. But the essence is when the young see that power is about amassing wealth for oneself, it kills the drive for hard work. And it's the reason why in a country like Nigeria, cultism is on the increase, kidnapping is on the increase, because all these are seen as quick ways to wealth. And that is the message which the leaders of the day have. That's what they have. It's the message that they pass on to the youth. I imagine attending a session, a symposium. Scholars attended that symposium, spoke beautifully on how to make society work. And then a leader of thought, the governor of a state, walks in and says, fine talk or fine speech, but I'll tell you all that matters is politics and politics and politics. Okay. So in a case where resources are scarce, so very scarce. Now, to some way get at those resources, people band together. It becomes the bane for cultism. It becomes the bane for ethnic nationalism. It becomes the bane for making groups subservient to mafias for syndicates and what have you. So the ineffectiveness of government, the greed of leaders in government really propel state fragility and encourage organized crime or terrorism in different ramifications. Okay, and now that's my answer to, or that's how my chapter keys into the concept of the book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jude. Since all states face some level of fragility, either high or low at some point, the adoption of fragility in the scope of this book improves the comprehension of the multidimensional factors that lead some states to higher levels of fragility when compared to their peers. So just to conclude this panel and the presentation of the global approaches on state fragility and organized crime. I have also a common question to each of you, Megan, Fausto, and Jude, that is based on your contribution. What are the main challenges to strengthen the capacity of the state to counter organized crime? I would like to start with Fausto.
Thanks, Mauricio. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Well, based on my contribution, I would say that one of the main challenges to strengthen the capacity of the state to effectively counter organized crime is the central government, and I would like to focus on the central government or the federal government in Mexico. The federal government's ability to adapt to the main qualitative changes in organized crime. What I mentioned earlier this afternoon, more violent in their tactics, economically diverse, fragmented, and also geographically strategic. So let me put an example of criminal fragmentation. And it is also portrayed in the book chapter. Some estimates suggest that the number of criminal groups in Mexico have grown by 900% since 2007, with an estimate of as many as 245 to 400 new criminal groups interacting, to say an euphemism, warring in the country. So I would say, and answering to your question, in order to adapt these new trends, the state needs to recalibrate the military approach and turn it into a more local law enforcement approach, and in particular, the need for civil law enforcement institutions that can perform in a professional way at the state level and at the municipal level, the lowest political administrative unit in Mexico.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Fausto. Recalibrate the military approach to focus on a local perspective and also civil law institutions. Jude, what about your answer to this question?
Okay, but let me start from a wider perspective and ask this question. Why does democracy work in developed countries, and why it's failing in the developing countries? And a major factor here is the extent of the vibrant, large middle class. It is the middle class that keeps democracy going. And why is that the case? When you have a large middle class, give or take 70% of society being the middle class, they protect that democracy. They love what they have. They enjoy what they have. They do not want to see it swept away or destroyed, so they protect it. It's in the same vein. It's in the same vein that the best way of addressing, these challenges is via horizontal equality amongst groups. So first of all, wage parity. In developing countries such as Nigeria, bridge the wage gap between the rich and the poor. It is offensive, damn offensive, to have the poorest of the poor in a country where the leaders happen to be the best paid in the world. First, bridge that wage gap. And then secondly, now Nigeria is a country that's strong on ethno-nationalism, so such that when you have a president in power, good or bad, evil or good, is supported by his people. So when it's one of the three majority groups, but that's there, nothing goes wrong with the man called Claudian because he has support of his people, no matter how bad, because the rules, and that is a template for horizontal inequality. His policies are in favor of his people, and the rest of the country could go to blazes. Okay, now the rest of the country virtually warms up for war against the group because of the incumbent. And we see this happen with election cycle. It doesn't help for security at all. So a second challenge, addressing a second challenge in Nigeria will be creating horizontal equity. Okay, creating horizontal equity. Now, but to achieve this first two, wage parity, horizontal equity, because if horizontal equity is created, the various ethnic groups will work together. And working together, they will help to protect the country's democracy and the country's spaces. Now, finally, connected to these two is the most important ingredient of all this political will. Without the political will of the elite, these two, horizontal equity and wage parity, cannot be achieved. And it also takes the political will of the elite to address the issue of ungoverned spaces, which is not just Nigeria's problem, but Africa's problem. You take care of ungoverned spaces, you take care of insecurity. Thank you.
Thank you, Jude. Addressing inequalities and improving horizontal equity is what we get from your contribution. Thank you very much. And Megan Kapp, based on your contribution, what are the main challenges to strengthen the capacity of the state to counter organized crime?
Thank you, Mauricio, and thank you to my panelists for providing such comprehensive and great responses. So based on my contribution, I think the main challenge to strengthen the capacity of the state to counter organized crime is in states' ability to implement those changes in an ethical and holistic way that recognizes the periphery impacts of those interventions and is considerate of all people who are impacted by such strategies. And I think to implement that in that way, I'm not going to provide as technical of an answer as my colleagues here. Mine is more theoretical, but I think to achieve that, we would need to see a really big shift in the way that we conceptualize criminality, and especially the way that we conceptualize women who engage in criminality. So I think when I look at the existing research, there is a narrative that women who commit crime lose their rights as mothers, or they're considered bad mothers, or they should be separated from their children because they're criminals, and how can they possibly parent a child in an ethical, healthy way that supports their development? I think we need to start shifting that narrative. In Canada, I do a lot of work on the front lines. I'm a grassroots community development practitioner. And based on what I've seen, these women are just in very complex situations, but the desire to mother and support their children and the capacity to do that in a really healthy way that is in the best interest of the child is there. And I think when we're talking about organized crime strategies and how the state can or cannot intervene in those strategies, I think we need that conceptual shift around women who engage in crime. We'll also need political buy-in. So a challenge in the region of Latin America is that we are seeing more authoritarian, tough on crime measures being implemented with increased use of pretrial detention, increased use of incarceration, and the children are suffering the effects of that because there is no consideration for them. The challenge is in some areas within the region, there's huge support for these initiatives. So it will need to be a full comprehensive strategy working at all levels, not just at the state, but also at the community levels, where we shift our way of thinking around criminality, women who engage in criminality, and the impact that it has on their children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan, for your suggestion and response on changing and improving, also criticizing some traditional narratives to improve our thoughts on that specific aspect. So just to conclude, although each chapter offers a variety of perspectives on organized crime and state fragility, which considers different countries and regions per content, the main contribution of this book, Global Approaches on State Fragility and Organized Crime, is the ability to read each chapter as part of a whole to increase understanding on how organized crime and state fragility are globally intertwined. And you can find this publication at the University for Peace website. And I just want to thank you to all of you and to say that we we connected Fausto from Mexico, Megan from Canada, Jude from Nigeria, and myself that I'm here based in Costa Rica in the global 24 hours conference on global organized crime. Thank you for all